So once again, welcome this evening. My name is Vanessa Courier Olson. I am the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and I am located in Overton, Texas, so in East Texas. And tonight's topic is scouting for insects in forage. So especially with the recent weather, having a lot of moisture, and as we move into our primary season for our warm season perennials, there are several forage insects that can be problematic and can cause substantial damage as well as impact our forage yield. So I wanted to cover those as we start to move into the season and the time of which we are at higher risk of having some forage insect pests. And so hopefully arm everyone with the tools necessary to be proactive and responsive if you do indeed have some issues, some insects that you need to control in your pastures and hay meadows. So first, we're going to start by talking about the fall armyworm. In previous years, when we've had some large populations of fall armyworms, it has created a lot of concern in producers or for producers as they've noticed other larvae potentially in their environments on their property. And so there are other armyworms besides the fall armyworm that we could potentially come across depending on other crops within our production systems as well as neighboring cropping systems. So the first is the beet armyworm. You can see there in the upper left-hand corner, it's green with a dark, bold, kind of a black stripe down both sides, and then what appears to be a black dot that looks similar to maybe an eye. It is typically a pest in vegetables, crops such as alfalfa, and there are some areas in Texas where we do have alfalfa, corn, as well as cotton, peanuts, and soybeans. So not necessarily a major concern in, say, Bermuda grass or even our cool season annual forages, but it could be something that may be found in neighboring cropping systems that may venture over into our pastures and hay meadows and could kind of raise an eyebrow if we did come across that particular larva. On the lower left-hand corner is the yellow striped armyworm. It is primarily a pest of fruits and vegetables. So if you happen to have a home garden or maybe your neighbor has vegetables or fruit crop that could potentially be susceptible to the yellow striped armyworm, you might see that you may come across that particular insect or that larva. So it does not necessarily feed on forages, primarily a pest or a concern in fruits and vegetables. So the true armyworm is one that we can come across in forages, primarily in corn and wheat. There have been reports of locating true armyworm, maybe in forage systems. They're primarily an issue, especially at kind of in the springtime, especially with wheat as well as corn during that early development and early growth of those crops. So it is not necessarily a pest or going to cause substantial damage in our warm season perennial systems, but it is something that we could likely come across. And it does, of those armyworms, it does look the most similar to the fall armyworm. The fall armyworm, as far as identification, is very dark in color, or very dark brown. It does have dark stripes going down both sides, and in the last segment, kind of the tail of the larva, has 4 black dots. The most distinguishing physical characteristic is the white inverted Y on the head of the fall armyworm. That's the easiest thing to locate, especially if you're just scouting a field and you're picking them up on equipment or on your boots, or even if you happen to be using a sweep net of some kind. It doesn't necessarily require a magnifying glass or a microscope to find that distinguishing characteristic of that white inverted Y. The full-grown larvae are about 1 to 1.5 inches long, just to kind of give you a size reference. Ideally, we would prefer to control them prior to that size, because at that point they are causing considerable damage. It's obvious to understand that the larger the larva, the more forage they are actually consuming. So I frequently get questions about the moths. So the fall armyworm moth has a wingspan of about 1.5 inches. The front pair of wings are dark gray with irregular pattern of light and dark areas. In these photographs, the upper left-hand corner is a male moth, and then the lower right-hand corner is the female moth. Moths are typically active at night when they feed on nectar, and they deposit egg masses during those evening hours. A single female can deposit up to 2,000 eggs and then have 4 to 5 generations per year. So a very common question that I get with fall armyworms often is, if someone has a population and has treated or made an insecticide application, common question is, okay, so I'm done. I'm not going to have any more fall armyworms because I've sprayed. And that is not necessarily the case, because we do or can have multiple generations within a year. So the armyworm, or the fall armyworm, does not overwinter in North Texas, but it does survive the winters typically in South Texas. Those populations will increase in South Texas in early spring, and then those generations that result from those population increases will ultimately move northward as the season progresses into Central and East Texas. They are primarily a pest of forages, especially Bermuda grass and any of our cool season forages that we are trying to establish in that fall period, late September, early October on. We can continue to have armyworm populations until we have a frost. So depending on our weather and forage availability, we can obviously have multiple generations, but we should continue to be aware and to scout for these populations until we actually have a frost. So even if you have treated previously, you need to continue to scout, especially if you really value that forage, whether it's in a pasture or a potential hay crop. Fall armyworms are picky consumers. They do prefer higher quality forage as well as irrigated forages. Now, there's not necessarily a lot of irrigation in East Texas, since we do have higher, fairly high average annual rainfall compared to the rest of the state. But if you happen to be in a more central, a little bit western edge of East Texas, there is potential that you may have irrigation or have interest in irrigation. But fall armyworm does prefer well-fertilized irrigated forages. So for example, if we have overseeded our warm season perennial forages with annual ryegrass or any of the small grains, or even cool season annual legumes, they are going to be much more attractive compared to that Bermuda grass stand, because those new seedlings of those cool season annuals are going to be very high in value and very desirable, unfortunately, by armyworms. They are called the fall armyworm because we do tend to see greater or larger populations in late July or early August. Often if we have been dry, which is very common in Texas for months like July and August, and then if we receive some moisture, then we tend to see an increase in armyworm populations. And that's when we start to notice them as we are scouting our fields. So one of my biggest recommendations is, if we have been dry for a period of time, and then we say for a month, and then we get some rainfall, we definitely should be scouting that day. Ideally in the morning when we do have some dew, and we can pick the armyworms potentially up on our boots or on our equipment that we might be traversing our pastures with. So like I said, those outbreaks will tend to occur following a rain. That's primarily because that moisture creates favorable conditions for eggs as well as small larvae to survive, especially in large numbers. When we tend to have dry conditions and heat, that really slows the development, slows or delays the hatching of those eggs, and it slows or delays the development of any larvae. So that's why we tend not to see many armyworms when we are very hot and dry. So as far as the life cycle, they complete their life cycle in 35 to 61 days. We've already seen the adult moth. That stage lasts for about 11 to 14 days. Then, like I said, females can lay up to 2,000 eggs. That will then hatch within 2 to 4 days, potentially a shorter period of time if weather conditions are appropriate. If we do have likely maybe some cooler temperatures along with some moisture, they may hatch a little bit faster. And we may have more survival, even if she has, if she lays a large number of eggs with ideal weather conditions, we could potentially have greater survival of those larvae. Obviously, the larva stage is the most damaging to our crops that lasts for about 14 to 28 days. They consume 85% of their diet in the last 2 to 3 days of that larva stage. So they will feed for 2 to 3 weeks, and the full grown larvae, like I mentioned, are about an inch to an inch and a half long. At that point, they will pupate into the soil, and then at the depth of about an inch and enter the pupal stage. The armyworm moth will emerge from the pupa in about 10 days, and then it continues to repeat the life cycle. So therefore, we can have multiple generations within a season. So scouting is the most important, is the easiest and the fastest method to determine if we have armyworms. A lot of people look for signs like the white, quote unquote, white cowbirds or the egrets that you might see within pastures or hay meadows. A lot of people think dragonflies are an indicator of fall armyworms. I highly recommend relying on scouting, actually walking or even riding your fields, especially starting with the kind of the borders or the outside, the edges, especially wooded edges of your property. Oftentimes moths will lay their eggs in those, kind of protected parts of the perimeter. So oftentimes that's where you will see those larvae emerging as kind of from the edge, and they march like an army across your field, causing substantial damage. So looking for armyworms, timing of scouting during the late evening and early morning, especially during cool, cloudy weather. During hot days, typically armyworms are low in the canopy. They may be under, close to the soil surface, and hide under loose soil or potential fallen leaves or any type of thatch. So this image is a great example of, wearing muck boots and walking through a field kind of in the morning when there's dew, and you'll very quickly pick them up on your boots, and you can identify them very quickly. It's hard to see in this picture in this situation, but you can very easily, when you look at those dark heads, you can see that white inverted Y, which is very distinguishing for the fall armyworm. I recommend continuing to scout every couple of days until we have a frost. Like I said, especially if we have been dry and we get some moisture, that is an ideal time to scout if you haven't already been on a somewhat regular basis. As far as their feeding habits, small larvae will chew the green layer from the leaves, as you can see pictured here, kind of creating a window pane effect. And then as those larvae get larger, they will start to notch the edge of leaves. That's much more common with insect damage, especially insects such as grasshoppers. So, but once again, scouting for the larvae is the easiest and I think simplest means of determining whether you have populations that are worth treating for. So like I said, the key to treating or managing fall armyworms is frequent inspection. Once the larvae are more than 3/4 of an inch long, the quantity of forage they eat increases dramatically. During their final 2 to 3 days of that larva stage, they eat 85% of their entire diet, so they can cause substantial damage. Infestations of more than 2 to 3 armyworms that are half an inch or longer per square foot is when we consider it and the appropriate time economically worth treating with an insecticide application. If it is practical, the recommendation is to apply insecticides early in the morning or late in the evening when those larvae are most likely very active and potentially actually feeding on that forage. So the sooner the better. Obviously, if it's warmer and the sun is out, they may be lower in the thatch and less likely to come in contact with an insecticide. So as far as making choices on treatments, you have to obviously consider the cost of the insecticide as well as the forage value, and then your forage needs as you move through the season. If it's a very, very valuable hay meadow, obviously it may be worth it to you in regards to making an insecticide application. Obviously, if you have some ryegrass seedlings or small grain seedlings, that would definitely be a crop that's well worth investing in making an insecticide application to control the fall armyworm. We do have a multitude of insecticides that are labeled for pastures and hay meadows. It is very important, as always, as we talk about insecticides, that we follow the label. Because the label is the law. So we want to make sure we are using products that are labeled for pasture and hay production, because there are products that are labeled for different scenarios, such as turf grass or fruits or vegetables. So do make sure you are using products labeled for pasture hay production, and all the ones I'm going to talk about tonight are labeled for such. There will be a variety as far as restrictions, such as haying or grazing restrictions, as well as whether it's a restricted use product or not. So Mustang Max is a general use pyrethroid. I will mention this again. Any of the insecticides whose active ingredient ends with THRIN falls under the class of pyrethroids. So there are a lot of pyrethroids that will have activity on a broad array of insects. So Mustang Max will have activity on other insect pests besides just the fall armyworm, such as the grasshopper or the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So as far as other options, carbaryl or 7 has historically been deemed to be inexpensive. If you look at the cost of the particular product on say a gallon or a unit basis, it does often appear to be very inexpensive. It is a general use product, so it doesn't require a license. There is a 14-day grazing as well as hay harvest interval with carbaryl. And unfortunately, it provides absolutely no residual control. Some of us may be familiar with using 7 or carbaryl in a garden environment, or maybe even a flower bed, trying to control various pests. So it has broad use across multiple crops. But when we look at the cost per acre, it's often much more expensive than some of our other options. One option that I really like is our insect growth regulators, such as diflubenzuron, which is an active ingredient found in Dimilin 2L. There are also generics of diflubenzuron that are a multitude of different names that will provide residual control up to 2 to 3 weeks, as long as that application is made before the larvae reach half an inch or longer. So it's primarily only going to be effective on very small larvae. And basically it interrupts that larval development. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you are using diflubenzuron as an insecticide for armyworms or even grasshoppers, it is not going to be an instant kill, and that confuses a lot of people. Those larvae have to start to grow for that insect growth regulator basically to interrupt that growth cycle. One of my recommendations is to apply a combination of diflubenzuron along with a pyrethroid, such as Mustang Max or any of the pyrethroids that are listed here, because all of our armyworms in our pastures or hay meadows are not all going to be the same size at the same time. We will likely have some very small larvae as well as some larger larvae, kind of depending on when we've been able to catch the particular infestation. Using that combination, the general use pyrethroid will help to control any larger larvae, and then the diflubenzuron will provide some residual control as long as that forage is not harvested. So that's an excellent combination. Historically, that is averaged around $3 per acre, give or take, kind of depending on the various cost. It may be based on the pyrethroid you select. Now that diflubenzuron there are some generic products with the same active ingredient, that cost has come down, has become more competitive as to what Dimilin used to be previously, when it was really our only diflubenzuron. There are some other products that provide residual. Rynaxypyr is an active ingredient, or is an active ingredient that can be found in several products, Prevathon, Coragen, as well as Besiege. Sorry, I don't have Besiege on here. It's Besiege. All 3 of those products have this particular active ingredient that can provide 2 to 3 weeks of residual control. Besiege also has a pyrethroid as an additional active ingredient. So that could be helpful if you're trying to control armyworms as well as the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So that could be a particular option. These products are very effective. However, they do tend to be a little bit more expensive on a cost per acre basis, but they are very effective at controlling armyworms as well as some other pests we'll talk about. So just kind of as a summary on fall armyworms, 3 or more fall armyworms per square foot is what we consider to be the economic threshold. If you have value, if your forage has value for you for harvesting or grazing, that is the point of which we feel like it is, and it is economical to actually treat with an insecticide. I will show you a resource towards the end of the presentation where you can locate a spreadsheet that can help you do some economic comparisons of different insecticides that are labeled for pasture and hay production, and that can help you make a much more economical decision. But the key to armyworm management is scouting. So highly recommend scouting those pastures and hay meadows every couple of days, especially when weather conditions are very supportive and really promote the growth and development of the fall armyworm. Considering the amount of moisture that we have received in parts of East Texas this spring, I'm really surprised I haven't heard of many reports of fall armyworms. Those populations, it is possible, may have just not moved up into our area as of yet. But I would recommend scouting your fields, especially if you see that they are valuable for your production system. So moving on to our second pest, that is the grasshopper. So there are 150 species of grasshoppers in the state of Texas. About 90% of those damage crops, gardens, trees, shrubs, or about 90% of the damage is actually caused by 5 species. So we'll see a picture here shortly of those particular 5. As we look at the life cycle or the biology of the grasshopper, grasshoppers deposit their eggs about 1/2 to 2 inches below the soil surface in pod-like structures. Each pod can potentially hold somewhere from 20 to 120 eggs that are basically massed together. Those egg pods, of course, are very resistant to moisture, cold, and they can easily survive our winters, especially if the soil is not disturbed. That is something that a lot of people ask about disking their Bermuda grass pastures or hay meadows during the winter to kind of expose those egg pods to maybe some colder temperatures or some drier conditions that might help to control those populations. So that could be a possibility, but we also have to keep in mind that by soil disturbance, we also could be promoting seed germination of some weeds. And there are some, we have to keep in mind that could also impact our Bermuda grass production the following season. So there's a lot of things to think about as we start to look at some of those practices potentially. Grasshoppers primarily deposit their eggs in fallow fields or fields that haven't been managed where there's a lot of vegetation, especially places like ditches, fence rows, other very weedy areas, as well as they will deposit their eggs in crop fields and hay fields. So they can be very damaging to forages. The nymphs, or the young grasshoppers, they're called nymphs. They look like adults, but they are smaller and have winged pads instead of wings. So they can't fly, but obviously they can jump. Those nymphs go through 5 to 6 developmental stages, and then they become adults in about 40 to 60 days. And that timing, very similar to armyworms, is very dependent on weather. Grasshopper development and will also be dependent on food supplies. So a lot of our management can be based around vegetation management, especially those very weedy areas or high vegetation growth. Now, grasshoppers do have natural enemies. One of those is a fungus that will often kill grasshoppers when our weather is warm and humid. So today was very humid, probably one of the more humid days so far that I can remember for 2021. So we can hope with the moisture that we've had and now some increasing heat, some humidity, will potentially promote that particular virus or fungus that will help to biologically control some of those grasshopper populations. There are a lot of other natural enemies, obviously birds, other insects, other nematodes, other issues can help to control those populations. So like I said, one of the main factors that affect those populations or grasshopper populations is weather. They do like dry, warm temperatures. I like to say they're kind of like teenagers. They like to bask or lay out in the sun. They are exothermoregulators, so they have to absorb heat to regulate their body temperature. And as long as we stay warm into the fall and even into the winter, those adult grasshoppers can continue to lay eggs. So once again, we need a freeze to kind of interrupt that reproductive process. Now, grasshoppers do only have one generation within a year, but because we have multiple species, it can appear, and obviously all those eggs aren't going to hatch at one time, it can appear that we have multiple generations. So once again, they can continue to be a pest until we actually have a freeze. So scouting, once again, is very important. They're a little bit easier to scout for, just walking through your fields. Obviously, they will start jumping around or potentially flying. But we would prefer to make an insecticide application before they start flying. Obviously, it's a lot harder to control them at that point. And grasshoppers consume half of their body weight every day. So obviously, the larger the grasshopper, the more damage they are causing within our forage systems. As far as habitat preferences, they are not picky consumers. They do tend to lay their eggs in high vegetation areas. So if we can keep ditches mowed or fence lines treated with herbicide to reduce some of that vegetation, that can decrease the desirability of females to lay those eggs in those areas. Higher temperatures, warm, dry weather will accelerate egg development, the nymphal growth, so they will develop faster, and then they will be greater or much more reproductive, as opposed to humidity and some moisture in the environment that can support those fungus, those issues that can help biologically control those populations for us. As far as monitoring populations, of course, scouting, walking through your fields is the best way to determine if you do have grasshoppers. The economic threshold, when we consider it to be threatening or economically feasible to treat for grasshoppers, is when you have 8 or more in a field per square yard. So this table shows you how many adults per square yard around the margin or the edge of that field compared to kind of in the center of that field. One recommendation, if you do have some high vegetation areas, you can start scouting earlier in the spring as those larvae or as those nymphs start hatching, because there are likely or potentially high egg populations in those areas, and you may see a lot of hatching in those high vegetation locations, and you can make some treatments along fence lines or at those perimeters and help reduce or keep those populations from moving into your fields or into your crops. All of the insecticides that we talked about earlier are also labeled for grasshoppers. There are a few that may only be labeled for grasshoppers or armyworms. So once again, always make sure you are referring to the label for the insects or the pests that product will control within your cropping system. Carbaryl, very short or no residual control on grasshoppers. Diflubenzuron will have activity and provide 2 to 3 weeks residual control on grasshoppers, as long as we are catching them very early in that very small nymph stage. Any of our pyrethroids will have activity on grasshoppers as well. It is important to understand that pyrethroids do not have very much residual activity. So using things such as diflubenzuron, the insect growth regulator, or even the Rynaxypyr products will help to provide some residual and hopefully reduce the number of applications that you might need to make within a given season. One very important thing to understand with Rynaxypyr, whether it's in Prevathon or Coragen, those labels will recommend adding a methylated seed oil as an adjuvant, especially for grasshopper control. So do make sure you are looking at that additional information within those labels to make sure you're using those products effectively, so you do have effective control. So our last insect pest is the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So the first reports in Texas were back in 2012. Prior to that, it has been a pest in other southern states, first being Georgia, as well as earlier before the reports in 2010 in Georgia, there were reports and confirmation in California and Hawaii. That was back in 2009 and potentially earlier. It is primarily a pest of Bermuda grass and stargrass. So any of our Bermuda grasses, whether it's a seeded variety or hybrid such as Tipton 85 or coastal, as well as turf versus forage, pasture, hay. So most of us if we have a Bermuda grass yard, we're not likely to see the Bermuda grass stem maggot because most of us are mowing weekly. That their life cycle is about 3 weeks. So we're kind of controlling or impacting those populations by our active mowing or other activities within our turf type situations. I have seen on the edge of golf courses where the mowers have turned and left some Bermuda grass that grew a little bit taller. I've actually seen Bermuda grass stem maggot damage in those locations. So it is a pest beyond just forages, but primarily in Bermuda grass and star grasses. So it is a pest primarily throughout the entire southeast of the United States, as well as in California and even Hawaii. This map kind of shows you where damage has been verified. This is a couple of years old, so it is, I think there has been some Bermuda grass stem maggot in southern Oklahoma and areas where they do grow Bermuda grass, and potentially in some other states. It is a very tropical pest, so it's not surprising that it is an issue, especially in the southeast. We do have a fairly tropical environment, warm temperatures, often high average annual rainfall. So as far as the pest itself, the adult is a fly that's yellow with a black head. It lays its eggs on the Bermuda grass plant. Those eggs hatch. That larva moves into the stem of the Bermuda grass plant. Here's a picture of the maggot. It's about 1/8 of an inch long, white with a black head. It moves into that stem and then consumes the plant material within that stem at the first node. So at the highest point on that Bermuda grass where leaves have emerged. So that does result in the death or the loss of the top 2 to 3 leaves of that Bermuda grass plant. That will not kill your Bermuda grass. It will continue to tiller and you'll have new growth. But unfortunately, if populations go untreated, those flies will continue to infest that new growth. And over time, that will have an impact on your yield. And it is potential that, continued repetitive damage over a long period of time could have an impact on the persistence of your stand. If that stand has value to you, it may be important as you scout to potentially look for that damage. Unfortunately, it's hard to locate the fly or the maggot. So we're primarily, unfortunately, looking for damage. In my experience so far, since 2012 in East Texas, we tend to start seeing damage around the end of June, beginning of July. So that's another important reason for talking about this subject now, is so we can start preparing and thinking about scouting, looking at our fields, paying attention, looking for these things, and then being proactive with our actions. So that obviously those top 2 to 3 leaves are dead and that stem can easily be removed from the rest of the plant. So that plant will continue to tiller and produce new growth from the crown. Unfortunately, that new growth could be reinfested as well. So the life cycle is about 3 weeks. So from adult fly to maggot, the maggot will then pupate into the soil and reemerge as a fly. So from fly all the way back to fly is 3 weeks. So a very short life cycle compared to armyworms, that's 30 to 60 days, or grasshoppers where it takes them 40 to 60 days to develop. So a very short life cycle compared to our other insect pests. So the University of Georgia, since they've had this issue since 2010, and they have a lot of Bermuda grass in that state, they have been successful at doing some research, trying to better understand the Bermuda grass stem maggot fly and how we can manage it more effectively. So they actually found that the Bermuda grass stem maggot prefers a denser canopy of Bermuda grass varieties such as common Bermuda grass or even coastal Bermuda grass compared to a more open or sparse canopy such as stargrass or Tipton 85. So Tipton 85 is the result of a crossing of a Bermuda grass with a stargrass. So that stargrass on the left looks very similar to Tipton 85. So the speculation is that the fly prefers that denser canopy because of safety or avoiding predators or what have you, but the fly feels more comfortable in those denser canopies. Those flies do not travel very far nor very high, so they do tend to stay within that canopy. When you look at the stargrass or the canopy density of even Tipton 85, it's very open as compared to other Bermuda grass varieties. So there is kind of a preference. Now, that doesn't mean you will not see Bermuda grass stem maggot damage in Tipton 85. I have seen it in all Bermuda grass varieties, turf or forage, whether it's hay or pasture. Now, if we have kind of a moderate stocking rate and we're keeping our Bermuda grass grazed fairly evenly, you may be less likely to see the Bermuda grass stem maggot damage in a pasture because our cattle are consuming that top portion of the plant where the maggot is residing and potentially causing damage. Now, in years where maybe you have a lower stocking rate, we have a lot of rainfall, so you have more forage production, then you may start to see damage in a pasture situation. Most of us will see damage primarily or initially in our hay meadows because we're harvesting every 3 to 4 or maybe longer harvesting span because of various reasons. So we're not harvesting on a weekly basis or on a regular basis. So there is an opportunity for that cycle to complete and for us to see damage within our hay meadows. So as far as our management recommendations, if you see damage within a hay meadow, our first recommendation is to harvest as soon as possible to reduce the yield impact. The longer you let that population continue to cycle through that hay meadow, they will ultimately reduce your hay yield. So harvesting as soon as possible is our first recommendation. Our second recommendation is following that harvest is to come back in and make an insecticide application with a pyrethroid. So many of the products we talked about earlier, whose active ingredient ends with THRIN. So beta-cyfluthrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, zeta-cypermethrin, all of those are pyrethroids. They will only have activity on the fly. That maggot is protected within that plant, so the pyrethroid will have no impact. So I do recommend making an application following a harvest and in another 7 to 10 days repeating an application, because at that point you will likely have some maggots that have pupated into the soil that will reemerge as flies, and you'll have an opportunity hopefully to take out more of that fly population with that pyrethroid application. Unfortunately, we currently do not have any insecticides that provide any type of residual control on the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So right now, our best recommendation is harvesting or the application of a pyrethroid. If you do see damage in a pasture, you could make an application with a pyrethroid at that time and then make a repeat application in another 7 to 10 days in hopes to control some of those adult fly populations. So far, the Bermuda grass stem maggot has successfully overwintered in various parts of Texas. So we will see if the sub-zero temperatures that we had in February and great part of our state will have an impact on those populations. So far, based on experience in other states throughout the southeast of the United States, we have not determined that weather has a big or a traumatic impact on those populations. I was recently talking to a colleague in Georgia. They do typically start to get reports at this time of year, kind of at the beginning of June, so a little bit earlier than us. But she has not, as of yet, had any reports or seen any damage. But for us in Texas so far, based on what I have experienced since 2012, kind of the end of June, beginning of July. So now, as you are scouting for things like armyworms and grasshoppers, you can also start looking for that damage, that loss of those top 2 to 3 leaves that could be a result of the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So once again, scouting is the best management tool for armyworms, grasshoppers, and then obviously looking for damage for the Bermuda grass stem maggot as well. Now, I did want to very quickly introduce you to a resource that I think you will find helpful as you are making economic decisions on insecticides. If you're not familiar, I have a website. It is called foragefacts.tamu.edu. From that website, if you select publications in the top tab, kind of on the left center, once you select publications, the very first publication that we are updating on an annual basis, so every year, is a herbicide and insecticide cost per acre spreadsheet. Once you select that, we'll take you to yet another page where you can open up the document or download the Excel spreadsheet onto your computer or onto a flash drive, and then becomes a kind of a workable document for you. So the only thing you can manipulate or change are the numbers in blue that says price per unit. So all of the other information, the product name, the chemical family, whether it's labeled for grasshoppers or armyworms, etc., you cannot change or alter. So you're not at risk of messing up that particular spreadsheet. So all you can manipulate are the numbers in blue. So this is a great tool to compare different products, not only looking at their price per unit, but also looking at their cost per acre. So that's what this spreadsheet does for insecticides as well as herbicides. It will automatically calculate the cost per acre for a variety of products. We've also kind of color coordinated, especially with the insecticides. Those in peach are kind of that tan color, are pyrethroids. You'll see under chemical family, it will say pyrethroid. All of those, the active ingredients end with THRIN. Those are the select products that will have activity on the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So that will hopefully make it much easier for you as you are selecting products. If you need to control or focusing on controlling Bermuda grass stem maggot, that will narrow that down so you're not having to scroll through 30 plus or more insecticides to locate one that fits your need. So we tried to group those based on chemical families to make that a little bit easier for you. We also included whether that product was labeled for grasshoppers and armyworms, or just one or the other. So that can also help you with insecticide selection. This, also want to point out, this is not a substitution for reading the labels. It only gives you a limited number of rates. It does not give you any additional information such as adjuvants or haying or grazing restrictions, other critical information that's important as we are using these products. But it is an excellent resource. If you have any questions on how to use this spreadsheet, we're happy to, myself or Dr. Vance are happy to help you in any way that we can. Now, I do want to, as we are wrapping up, and I'm happy to answer any questions, I did want to share with you about the upcoming Ag in the Evening programs. The next one will fall on July 13th. Dr. Jason Banta will be talking about hay and feed testing factors that affect quality. In August, on the 10th, I will be talking about winter forage options. And then in September, on the 14th, Dr. Banta will be talking about winter feeding and supplementation. If hopefully you have seen this flyer, or if you need a link for any of these particular meetings, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the agents that we're collaborating with for the Ag in the Evening series. And that would be Houston, Gregg County, as well as Tyler County. Those county agents are always happy to help and answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I will be happy to answer any questions. You're welcome to unmute, or you are also welcome to use the chat if you would prefer.